I was invited to the Capcom offices in London to play the final preview build of Monster Hunter Wilds that not only has the new monsters but also a ton of gameplay changes that were made to all of the weapons. And so in this video I will be going in depth talking about all of them, what differences did I spot, how different the weapon felt, how were some of the buffs and the nerfs, and a few more things. Now I do have to disclose that this is not the final build, so there might be some changes before the game is fully released. Additionally, given the limited time that we were able to play and record at Capcom, while I was able to play with all of these weapons, it was pretty difficult to test out some mechanics in specific, but I will be sure to address that when I talk about those weapons. Additionally, I also want to give a huge shout out to Jono at Capcom for inviting me, to you guys for having made this possible, and to the following content creators for giving me extra footage, as unfortunately my hard drive got corrupted and I ended up losing some files. Those being Rurikon, Ark, Rage Gaming, Arix Gaming, and Nightside. A huge thank you to all of them. Well, with that being said, I hope you are all as excited for Wilds as I am, and let's get started. So let's start with the Sword and Shield. When I first picked up this weapon in the beta, I was somewhat disappointed. Don't get me wrong, the Sword and Shield was still reliable but lacked impact, and the Perfect Rush, which in my opinion is the coolest tool in the Sword and Shield arsenal, was whack. It simply lacked damage for it to be worth all of the necessary commitment that is required to pull off that move. Thankfully, however, in the build that I played that had all of these changes, the Perfect Rush felt so much better. I was getting KOs consistently with it and dealing a lot of damage, and also because we now have proper hit stop in the game, it felt a lot more weighty and satisfying, but that's not all, as a lot more was buffed for the Sword and Shield. Like for example, Rising Slash can now be used while you are guarding, which allows you to open up a lot more combo routes than before, and you aren't punished as much for going for a block because maybe you want to trigger a clash with the monster and you don't get it, but because you're blocking you could only go into the weaker attacks. With Rising Slash you now have a lot more options. Additionally, they have improved the chop combo and the side slash combo by again making the hits feel more meaningful, dealing more damage, and it also felt like you could go a little bit further while you were performing, especially the chop combo. And of course, another huge change that the Sword and Shield received, which is a huge buff, is that they have added more iframes into the backstep and the sliding swipe. I mean, I can't say this with 100% certainty, but Capcom themselves stated that they have improved the evasion effectiveness of both of these moves, and while I was at Capcom playing with the Sword and Shield, it's definitely felt like I had a lot more iframes with the backstep and the sliding swipe, and overall I'm much happier with the way Sword and Shield felt after I played this new build of Monster Hunter Wilds. Now I do want to touch on the dual blades very quickly, because even though they were not mentioned in the pre-launch community update as one of the weapons that would receive massive changes, I think I should mention that the dual blades were a lot more powerful this time around. And that is quite simple because in the beta we only had access to raw damage dual blades, which naturally, dual blades being a weapon that is very much suited to dealing elemental damage and applying status effects. Now that I was actually able to craft different weapons, and I played around with the Lalabarina dual blades as well as the Chemitrist dual blades, so that is paralysis and fire, they felt way better than they did in the beta test. And this is coming from someone that already loved the way that dual blades felt in the beta test. And from what I played at Capcom, fighting against Congalala, Lalabarina, Uthduna, Nursilla, and Rompompolo, I think that most of them were weak or at least neutral to fire damage, and so I was just outputting a crazy amount of damage while having a ton of iframes, and when I used the Lalabarina dual blades I paralyzed Congalala like 4 different times, so yeah, they definitely felt amazing, and I think it's worth mentioning it here in the video. Now as for the Greatsword, honestly Greatsword is just in a really good spot. They haven't made any changes from the beta test to the version that I played, at least not that I am aware of, but throughout my entire play session the Greatsword felt fantastic, though I didn't quite play it as much as one like Rage Gaming, but whenever I saw him play he was doing fantastic with the weapon, and I think Greatsword mains should be excited for the weapon designs that they're gonna get. I'm telling you, some of these look absolutely crazy. Now another weapon that got some pretty big changes in this update that I was able to test out was the Switch Axe. And in the different beta tests, by far one of the worst things about the Switch Axe was that it just lacked impact. I think it was the weapon that lacked hit stop the most out of all of them, and for that reason the weapon just didn't feel very satisfying to use. However, in the build that I played, I was able to test that and it felt so much better and smoother to play with the weapon. And then of course you have all of the changes on top. They have made it so that whenever you swap to sword mode in the middle of the combo, the morphing slash felt more satisfying, and I think that they might have tweaked the damage values for this move in particular because I was able to flinch the Alpha Doshiguma 2 or 3 times with this move alone. I believe they've also made the full release slash more powerful, but of course it's hard to compare the damage numbers as I was using different switch axes against different monsters, and then you get the hit zone values on different parts of the monster and whatnot. But one very cool change that switch axe received, which is a massive buff in my opinion, is that you now actually get armor while you are performing the full release slash. Much like, for example, when you are using a longsword and you go for the Spirit Helm Breaker, the activation of that move, the thrusting attack, has hyper armor. That is the exact same thing here with the full release slash. And given how powerful that move is for the switch axe, and that it has this long animation where you are very vulnerable to taking damage, the fact that you gain hyper armor while you are doing it is a huge buff in my opinion. And I should also mention that I also got to play with the Chemetris switch axe, and it felt way more satisfying to have elemental damage on the switch axe rather than just using a raw damage switch axe like we did in the beta test. Now I also want to touch on the charge blade because it definitely felt like they did a couple of changes to the weapon. It felt like the new move where you load up the files and transform the weapon was a lot quicker, and I think that they might have also added a guard point to the charge blade where there previously was none, but that's the impression that I got for the weapon from my limited time playing it at Capcom, and I think there were a couple of other content creators saying the same thing, so I don't think I'm alone in saying this. Now the lance is one of the weapons that is especially interesting for a couple of reasons, because while I was at Capcom testing the different weapons, I was actually told that the lance in particular was the only weapon that didn't have all of the changes implemented into the kit. So I was not able to properly test every single change that it received, but I did notice quite a few changes. And honestly, I'm gonna say it right now, lance might just be the most underrated weapon in Wilds because it was pretty crazy how aggressive I was able to be with the lance, just constantly poking monsters and dealing damage, all the while being able to block attacks and having access to the more powerful counters that I can also block while charging up the big counters. Another big change that you can see listed here on the image is that following a perfect guard or a power guard, you can go straight into the big finisher counter that you get after doing the triple high poke combo. And with how powerful that move in particular is, that is a huge boost to your damage with the lance. I think that the lance is going to be that type of weapon where if you like the playstyle, the identity of the weapon of being there, permanently attacking the monster non-stop and perfect guarding attacks whenever the monster attacks you to then counter with more powerful attacks, then you'll be happy to know that the lance has gotten even better. Now I didn't play with any elemental or ailment lance, I just used the default one because of the limited time I didn't have time to farm materials for a different version, but I believe lance is gonna feel even better once you get your hands on elemental damage, paralysis, blast, etc. Now as for the Gunlance, the only real difference there was in this build is that you had more shelling types available to play with, and one note in particular is that one of the Gunlances said something along the lines of weaker shelling, which I cannot show it to you, we aren't allowed to show any menus or crafting or any of that kind of stuff, but that's just hilarious. Now I want to talk about the longsword for a couple of reasons. One in particular is that we actually had access to the Quicksheathe skill in this build of the game through an armor set, and my fellow content creator Nightside was actually able to test the differences between not having Quicksheathe and having Quicksheathe level 3, which is what you will be seeing on screen, and as you can see, it is a huge difference. So it looks like Capcom followed the same route as Monster Hunter Rise, making Quicksheathe a pretty powerful skill that is definitely gonna have a big impact for longsword hunters and is likely going to be on every single one of their builds. Now the other thing about the longsword is that while it wasn't directly stated as being a weapon that would be affected by these massive changes in the pre-launch community update, there was a statement, I believe by Yuya Tokuda-san, that said something along the lines of they were aiming to nerf that weapon along with the bow, which I'll talk about in a moment. And honestly, from my experience and everyone that I talked to, we didn't really feel any nerfs to the weapon, so maybe it was nerfed, but we just didn't feel it. Maybe is going to be nerfed later on, or maybe the nerf just is a very small change. It's the type of thing where it's very hard to test, especially if you don't have the exact numbers, but if they actually nerfed the weapon in the build that I played, I honestly didn't feel it. Longsword was still quite powerful and a lot of fun, and performs just about as you would expect. The hammer was still the same bonk stick that we all know and love, so there is not much to say about that weapon, and while the hunting horn didn't receive any direct changes, there's a couple of notes that I want to bring up, specifically about a couple of melodies that you'll be able to perform that are new for the hunting horn. One of them is a new offset melody that you can perform, which I believe was an echo bubble slash that you were able to place down on the ground like you can with any other echo bubble, but as the name would imply, it deals slash damage, meaning that you would actually be able to cut monsters' tails with it. Now you can still cut monsters' tails with the hunting horn, you can do it with the stabbing attack, it's just not a reliable option, but you'll have a better chance of doing so with this echo bubble. Now the other melody, I'm not 100% sure on the name exactly, and unfortunately my hunting horn footage is among the weapons that I lost, but it was basically the same as mud resistance, but for the oil well basin locale, because in there you're going to be walking through residue and you're going to be slowed down, much like you would by mud in Monster Hunter World when walking around the Wildspire Waste. So that's pretty much the same thing. You have a melody that you can use that is gonna make it so that you aren't slowed down in that particular area. Not a particularly brilliant melody to have on a weapon, but there you have it. And a lot of people were upset about the Glaive, as a lot of the aerial playstyle of the weapon had been diminished in Wilds, as you couldn't really vault into the air more than once. The weapon also felt a little bit clunky, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, given the controls that you need to play with this weapon effectively. That being said, in the build that I played, you'll be happy to know that the aerial playstyle of the Glaive is back. That's right, whenever you perform the aerial combo, the vaulting dance, you can now bounce back into the air up to 3 times, whereas before you could only do it once. For comparison, in Rise you could also do it up to 3 times, and in World you could do it up to 5 times. That said, this aerial playstyle has also been massively buffed, as your aerial attack power will be increased by 2 levels each time that you vault, meaning that if you do the vaulting dance combo in the air, as you are performing it, you would essentially be able to buff the damage of the big attack, the descending slash, where you expend all of your kinsects to deal a ton of damage. Though naturally you need to be careful and actually use that attack before you land on the ground, which by the way, the descending slash has also the added benefit this time around of counting as an offset attack, meaning that if the monster is attacking you as you perform the attack while going down with the descending slash, or while going up with the ascending slash, you'll be able to counter that attack and knock back the monster. Now I didn't actually manage to pull this off, I tried it multiple times and the timing always felt a little bit off, but that is something that you'll be able to do with the Glaive. And given that that is the most powerful tool that you have available with the weapon, being able to counter monster attacks with your most powerful attack is pretty fantastic in my opinion. Additionally, Glaive hunters also got a couple more buffs, like the orange extract negating some knockback effect while your weapon is drawn. You don't necessarily gain hyper armor, but they give you some additional armor like you could in the previous games, which was lacking in the beta version of the Glaive in Wilds. Additionally, when you have all 3 buffs, the red, white and orange extracts, you will also mitigate wind pressure, tremors and roars, much like you could in the previous games. Again, you're not necessarily negating them, you just get essentially earplug small, tremor resistance level 1 and wind pressure resistance level 1. I honestly don't know why they were not present in the beta test version. It felt like a weird omission given that both Rise and World had these buffs, but regardless, if you guys haven't watched my videos, I personally love the way that the Glaive plays in Wilds. I know that this is a controversial opinion, but the weapon just feels a lot more fun to play this time around for me personally. Though I will admit that even after all of these changes, the weapon still feels somewhat clunky to play. Now you have ways of mitigating this by changing your controller layout, which is exactly what I did, on top of having pedals on my controller, which further helps the problem. But for example, while I was at Capcom, I didn't have the different keybinds and I didn't have the pedals on my controller, so pulling off every single move with the Glaive felt a little bit weird and awkward. Unfortunately, they didn't change that control problem, so you're going to have to deal with it some way or another. If you're curious about the way that I fix it, I'll talk about in my future video dedicated to the Glaive exclusively, but that is something that you still have to deal with, unfortunately. So if you didn't like the weapon for that reason alone, I'm sorry, but that's still a thing. And I also want to talk about the bow, as it was one weapon that was stated to be nerfed. They changed the bow by effectively toning down the tracer shots, which is the new thing that you can attach to the monsters and then shoot them to deal more damage. And to balance that, they have increased the damage of pretty much everything else. And honestly, I like this change, but I can see some people disliking it, as you are kind of taking away some of the special novelty that you get on this weapon. Now that said, the second change that the bow received is one I didn't in particular like a whole lot. Now I want to disclose that I only did a single hunt with the bow, but from my experience, the way that they changed it, making it so that whenever you are locked onto a monster with focus mode, to perform the focus strike, that is, locking onto the different wounds, they have put a little bit of a delay in between them to where you can't exactly lock onto all of them in an instant like you could before, and it feels a little bit awkward in my opinion. Maybe it's not because I haven't played bow as much as I used to in Rise and especially Iceborne, but I think that there is a little bit of a contrast between what you are able to do now in the beta test compared to how the focus strike with the bow works in the build that I played with. I'm very interested in seeing how everyone is going to feel about this, but that was pretty much the only change out of everything that I played with where I was like, I just don't like it very much. Now unfortunately, given the limited time that we had to play in this play session, I was not able to test out the bowguns. I'm sorry, but I'm not particularly fond of those two weapons. I never liked them very much, and I only really use them whenever it's time to take them out to farm decorations in the endgame, for example, so I didn't really try them out, and while I did look at the different ammo types, I can't really comment on that or show it to you guys. That is due to embargo reasons, so yeah, there's not much to say about those two weapons. Overall, the build just felt really fantastic, as I said before in my previous video, and as you might be able to see from the gameplay in the background, everything felt fluid. The animations were a lot more satisfying thanks to the hit stop, and at this point I'm suffering from withdrawal. But that being said, I'll have some more videos talking about the final preview build that I was able to play with, as I do have a couple more things that I want to show you guys. But if you have any questions that you would like me to address in regards to this build, things that I might have spotted you guys are curious about, let me know all of that in the comment section below, as I will gather as many questions as possible to make a video talking about all of them. With that being said, thank you so much to everyone for watching and supporting the channel, as you guys are the entire reason as to why I was able to actually go to Capcom and record all of this. So thank you, truly thank you for watching. And of course, thank you to the content creators I listed before. Their links will be listed below the like button, so you can watch all of their coverage as well. So as always, my name is Dark Hero, thank you all so much for watching, and happy hunting!